Hi everybody, welcome back to Cmn 9, our mass media class, and this is for Wednesday, September 9th. And what I would have done is sent you an email, so I hope that you received it, where I was talking a little bit about how we are going to be structuring the class after I received some feedback from you. And basically, you can see that in the notes section here, I've also summarized what I had indicated in the email, that I'm going to be making instructor videos that I will be posting by Wednesday at 6 p.m., and that would be the time that we would normally be meeting, and that's when I will cover some of the content of the class. And then I will have a discussion forum where I will ask you to respond to an attendance question. Your response is basically your attendance for that particular class. And you have 24 hours to respond to that question. But if you need an extension, please ask me. I'll be happy to give it to you. I try to be as flexible as possible, and especially during these particularly challenging times, I want to be flexible. I will be holding optional chat sessions and optional Zoom sessions. Again, they're optional. You're not required to attend, but you can think of that as a way for engagement and participation if you so wanted to. And the optional chat session will be on Monday from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. And if you look at the upper section of our Moodle page, you'll see that there's a section for that. And our optional Zoom sessions will be on Wednesdays, also from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. And again, if you look in the upper section of our Moodle page, you should be able to see that. And in terms of your attendance question, your requirement is to answer the attendance question, but certainly any interaction that you do with your peers, I sort of think of that as participation, much like as if you were participating in class. And again, I know some people learn through lots of dialogue and interaction, and some learn through just quietly experiencing, so both are well. But I do encourage you to read all of the responses in the attendance question class discussion forums, just so that you can get a sense as to what you would have heard if you were actually in class and what your classmates are thinking. Office hours are by appointment, so you can make an appointment with me and we can meet via Zoom or through chat room or through telephone, whatever is most convenient for you. Your written assignments you can send to me to my email, and then I will review them and put feedback on them and then return them back to you in your email. And there is an updated syllabus posted on Moodle. Don't know if any of you were interested in my English 229 class, my Gothic literature class, which was full and had a wait list, but because of popular demand, I suppose, we've opened another section. So if you were interested in Gothic literature, which is a nice companion to this particular class, you are still able to add on to that particular course. And in terms of where we are, however, is talking about some of the text. Now, I understand the difficulty might be that you may not necessarily have access to all of the text. Worry not, I took that into account, and that you might need a little bit of time in order to get the textbooks. So you can always do the readings after the fact. And our first written assignment isn't going to be due for a couple of weeks, so you've also got some chance to catch up with the text. The first set of readings that I assigned for today are basically just background information. I wanted to lay out the foundation of what horror film is and some of the traditions of studying it from an academic perspective, just to give you some foundation. We're not actually going to begin the actual class itself until, as far as I'm concerned, next week, when we get to view and talk about the horror film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So this is preparing you for that. And eventually you will be doing a writing assignment about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where you will have an informal journal response, but that's after you've actually seen the film and that we've talked about it. In terms of what I had assigned for today from the text Projected Fears was just the introduction, which I thought laid a nice foundation, and the text horror film chapters What is Horror, which is chapter 4, so for us to try to define that. Chapter 5, Why of Horror, why is it that people are attracted to this? And chapter 6, which happens to be Critics and Censors. Now, we have a third text that's called Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, and I didn't assign anything from that particular text for this class. However, I should let you know that those who put together that text also put a documentary together, also entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. And that's part of what today's class is going to be, is viewing that particular documentary. And you can see that I found a link for it so that it's available online so that you can watch that documentary. It's about an hour and a half long or so. It's no substitute for reading the book, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, but it does give a nice overview and perspective about the idea of horror and horror film. So I thought that would be a good way for us to begin. But in terms of the text, Projected Fears, and that's the introduction, you can see the pun on the idea of projection, the idea that a film is projected, but there is projection that goes on with horror as well, and that it isn't necessarily always what it appears to be. There are lots of hidden and embedded meanings within it. The introduction talks about popular culture. Now, a culture, I suppose, in the broadest sense of the word, is any kind of group membership. And within that group, there's a predictive element of things like behaviors, which are actions, things like attitudes, which are feelings, positive, negative responses, beliefs, things that you might think are true and false, and values, which are deeply embedded and probably include all of the above. And usually when we talk about culture, we talk about large cultural groups. We talk about a group based on something like perhaps gender or age or ethnicity or perhaps region or nationality. And this particular class with media is talking about the culture of the United States. Now, that said, that a culture doesn't necessarily have to be that broad and all-encompassing. A culture can be very small. It could be something like a school. GCC has its own culture in and of itself, with its own attitudes and behaviors and values and beliefs, so that you can get a sense of perhaps a predictive element of how the individuals might react to and with one another. But that said, you want to be careful not to stereotype, because there are individual variances that are involved in that. That's something that I talk about in my public speaking class, actually, when we talk about culture. And in fact, if you're interested, I don't know, but I have a late start public speaking class that just opened, that will be starting at the ending of October, if you need a late start class. But at any rate, going back to popular culture, popular American culture, films that are mainstream, that have had wide appeal, and somehow have achieved this kind of cultural immortality, in that they are universally known and that they are revisited over and over again. They're more than just fads. Part of the reason for that, and it's one of the things I talked about in my Gothic literature class, is that they tend to be allegorical or symbolic. Now, these are literary terms when we talk about things being representational or abstract. In other words, there's a nuance and a depth and a sophistication there that might not be immediately obvious from the surface. And what these films tend to do is to reflect our collective fears or anxieties as a culture. And it oftentimes is generational, especially when we think about the idea that horror film is so attractive to adolescents, and of course every generation is going to have its own adolescent group. And this idea of adolescents engaging in the deviant and being able to experiment with the deviant in a safe way is perhaps one of the reasons for the appeal of horror film, but we'll revisit that again fairly soon. And that these iconic films that have become part of our myth pool, if you will, the Frankensteins, the Draculas, the Psychos of the world, they have familiarity to them because there's certain conventions that are established within the horror film, and also shock. There are also new elements that are associated in there in order to keep our attention. So, in the text horror film, it talks a little bit about what is horror. Again, genres can be difficult to define. There oftentimes is a lot of genre blending. Again, if any of you are in my Gothic literature class, you'll see how similar these two classes are, at least for this particular week. And that, yes, we can categorize something as horror, but also it can be categorized perhaps as something like science fiction. Frankenstein is a very good example of that, where it oftentimes is viewed as something that's horrific, but yet it also is studied in things like science fiction classes. The distinction between the two is that science fiction should be something that could be achieved in the natural world with the science that we have or will have in the future, as opposed to horror, which is usually something that perhaps deviates from the natural order and could never be achieved through science, the supernatural, if you will, that which defies the natural. Even something like fantasy, where you're setting something in a completely different universe, Lord of the Rings, can also have elements of horror or monstrosity associated with it. So you can see that there's a good amount of blending between the genres. But there are some elements that you can expect. The first that I believe I just mentioned is monstrosity. There's some sort of an entity, ultimately, that is outside of oneself. If you've heard of the other, the idea of that which is different from you, that serves as a way of instituting some sort of an attack. This leads to fear and anxiety, and those are the emotions that we should expect when watching a horror film, fear and anxiety. Films that threaten our sense of moral order or normality in the world. There is some sort of figure under threat, and that there is also the possibility of something supernatural, but there is ambiguity oftentimes associated with it too. And it's one of the ways that multiple viewers can experience these films and derive satisfaction from them, so that if you don't necessarily believe or want to embrace a supernatural explanation, you could perhaps embrace another, for instance, a mental state. Eerie atmosphere. Atmosphere is oftentimes greatly important. Think about how Halloween is oftentimes defined by its use of atmosphere. And doubling. And you will oftentimes see in films too, so we'll talk a little bit about the doppelganger, which is supposed to be our other self, that there's another entity with our physical characteristics that exist. Even something like mirror images and doubling. So those are some of the things that you can expect. Why can you expect some of this? It comes from the Gothic tradition, actually, which we will be talking about next class, and a literary tradition. But in terms of why of horror, which was chapter 5 that I had assigned for us today, why is it that someone would willingly want to walk into a state of anxiety, a state of fear? And there is a certain release of endorphins that's involved with this, so that perhaps can make it somewhat pleasurable. There is catharsis, a purging of emotion, the ability for us to be able to experience a deviant or taboo state in a safe way. I've oftentimes made analogies with things like riding roller coasters, and that ultimately you know that you're in a safe place, so you can still experience that thrill. And assuming nothing goes wrong, and nothing should go wrong, you can do it in a safe way. You wouldn't have the same pleasurable feeling if your car were acting that way, because you wouldn't be able to predict the outcome. So that said, not everybody rides a roller coaster and experiences a thrill that is somewhat pleasurable. So it's very individual in some ways. And in terms of the why of horror, that particular chapter talks about a good number of theorists and their speculations as to why it is horror is appealing, and how it is that horror can be more than just its surface meaning, but that it basically is examining the fears and anxieties of our culture. It's a reflection of the fears and anxieties of our culture. Stephen King is probably one of the best known authors in the horror tradition, and he wrote a text called Danse Macabre that I highly recommend, that we study in my Gothic Lit class, where he talks about that idea of what is horror and why is it that we're drawn to it. And from his perspective is that it allows us to engage in deviance, but to be able to return to the status quo. If you know anything about Shirley Jackson's very famous text, then you probably know how the lottery allows us to engage in deviance. And if you haven't read the short story, I won't say anything more, no spoiler alerts, but definitely it's worth a read. That said, there's another author that you may not know as well as Stephen King. Stephen King has basically established his reputation with writing in the tradition of Gothic and horror, and he oftentimes has had his text translated over into film. Actually, there's even been some debate as to whether or not The Shining, at least according to some scholars and critics, is being the scariest film that's ever been made. If you've ever seen The Shining, then you know that Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining is very different than Stephen King's written text of The Shining. That's not that unusual, that oftentimes the film very much deviates from the text itself. But that said, the film stands on its own as a superb film, as well as the book stands on its own, in my belief, as a superb book. But at any rate, another theorist that specializes in horror that you may not know as well because he doesn't write fiction, he just mostly does scholarship about horror, is Robin Wood. And probably his most famous essay is An Introduction to the Horror Film. And it talks about that one of the reasons why we're attracted to horror and a horror film is because it lets us address things that are psychologically repressed within ourselves, that which is considered other or deviant or different. But there are others. Sigmund Freud, you've probably heard of as the father of psychology, and while he didn't necessarily study horror per se, he did write a very famous essay entitled The Uncanny, where he talks about a fright that brings back repressed things that are repressed and old. In other words, that what scares us is both familiar and strange at the same time. Think about something like a zombie, which is familiar. It's someone we know, and it looks like humans, or human, at least somewhat, but yet it's also strange and different at the same time. There are hundreds of scholars out there that have done work with horror film, and I mentioned just a few, and the textbook mentioned a few others. Julia Kristeva talked a little bit about bodily excretions in relation to horror, and about how they represent both ourselves, they're part of us, but yet they are also other, they are outside of us. Barbara Creed is known for her scholarship about female, specifically female monstrosity within horror, and that monstrosity is oftentimes portrayed as female. Carol Clover is known for her final girl theory, and this works particularly well for slasher films at the end, when you're left with this final girl who, through phallic means, basically is able to survive against the odds. We'll see that in Halloween. And there are many, many others. And it's not that I expect you to read all of these scholars. I just want you to know that even though this genre is oftentimes much criticized and much maligned, there's been some serious academic work that's been associated with it, particularly in media studies. And the films have been, and the text sometimes too, have been very maligned. They've been referred to, and audiences as well, for these films being vulgar, immoral, crass, even violent in some respects. And again, part of that I think has to do with because they're oftentimes associated with adolescents who watch these films voraciously sometimes, and this idea again of the opportunity to break a taboo in a rather safe way. But adolescents are not the only ones who watch these films. There oftentimes is a stereotype that males are more drawn to these than females. If you've read the selection that I had scheduled for today, you'll see that what scholars are finding is that it's pretty even, but that it's more likely that females would be watching on their own in the comfort of their own homes rather than watching in a more public place such as theater, and you know, do with that as you will. But I think that what we will see throughout the course of the semester are a series of horror films that in one way or another represent our American culture and that have captured our imaginations so that they still have significance today. And that while you may not necessarily have seen all of these films, chances are these films have influenced other films that you have seen. And I think I had indicated last class that what I try to do was to divide things up by decade. In fact, I believe it's Projected Fears that also tries to identify the most seminal horror films. And some of those films I agree with, and I've indicated that by including them in our class syllabus. And some of those I don't necessarily agree with, and I've put my own films in, and we could talk about the reasons why as the semester progresses. But I wanted to begin with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which starts us with the 1920s, which would really be the very beginnings of horror film, so that we can finally end up eventually, if I'm doing something that's close to decade, generation by generation, so we can end up within our own time period. So basically, what you've got for next class, I have a couple of readings assigned. The Origins of Film Gothic, that happens to be in the Nightmares text, and also genreification in the horror film text. So we'll talk a little bit more about genres and the Gothic and literary tradition associated with horror and ultimately with horror film. And again, we will be viewing next class The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So it's a great German impressionistic film, and I'll include a link to that. And that will be what you will be writing your first journal on, but that won't be due until the 23rd of September. So next class we get to talk a little bit about the film and so forth. And for today's attendance question, I thought what would be interesting is for you to answer on our class discussion forum by Thursday the 10th by 6 p.m. So you have 24 hours. Again, if you need more time, please let me know. For you to answer, what did you think was one of the most interesting things in the documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, and why? And again, you can decide how much or how little to interact with your peers, but I encourage you to read all of the responses. That means that you need to watch the documentary, and again, you can see that I've included the link for that. It's approximately an hour and a half long, and gives, I believe, a very nice overview of horror and horror film. So I hope you're well. I'm doing well, and I look forward to our meeting next week and talking about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Take care. Bye-bye.